The average American's income was twice as high as the British workers and 4 times as high as the Italians. They could buy a range of goods unknown in Europe. For Karen Pace, a little girl on Long Island in the 50s, the family's new movie camera recorded a period of boundless confidence, when it seemed the good times would go on forever.
My mom was a housewife and a mother, and she stayed home. And my father was a roofer, so he was a blue-collar worker. I was his pride and joy, needless to say, Daddy's little girl. And he couldn't do enough for me, and neither could my mother. They were brought up through the Depression and the war. Obviously, I was part of the baby boomers after the war, and they just wanted to see me have what they couldn't. There was a few Christmases that were really great. I had 5 or 6 dolls, maybe 4 stuffed animals, 3 games, 2 educational toys, and a new set of drums. So we had a lot of fun with that. My mother could have given up the drum set. It was golden. I got everything I wanted. I couldn't have asked for anything more as a child.
Dr. Benjamin Spock's The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care caused a stir when it was first published in 1946 by claiming parents shouldn't hit children. That was revolutionary for the time. But in every other way, Spock was conventional, especially in his belief that women should take the lead in child rearing. A woman's place was in the home. During World War II, women got a taste of life outside of the home. With the men off fighting, women were expected to staff factories and offices. Designer brands made women's slacks with enough legroom to move around comfortably in factories. When the men returned from the war, women were expected to exit their jobs and go back home. Most of them did. In the 1950s, the fashion designer Christian Dior designed dresses with small waists, a definite sign that women were expected to be domestic and feminine again. But every woman was affected in some way by their experience during the war. Not every woman happily moved back into the home during the baby boom. Some kept some form of employment, even if it was a temporary office job. While the number of women in the workforce decreased after the war, it remained higher than it was before the war started. A permanent shift was starting to take place in the workforce. Research into a medication to prevent pregnancy started during the 1950s. This would allow women to decide when, or even if, they had children. Without the demands of motherhood, they would be able to dedicate their youth to career or school. At the same time, a graduate of Smith College named Betty Friedan began research into her book, The Feminine Mystique, which was finally published in 1963. Friedan surveyed thousands of women and found most of them felt trapped. While they largely enjoyed motherhood and ascribed to traditional gender roles, most of them wondered if there was something more to life. They had a taste of financial independence during World War II. Many were educated. Now, they found themselves trapped within the 4 walls of the suburban home, what Friedan called the comfortable concentration camp. Friedan didn't use the term feminism, but her book would herald a renaissance in the feminist movement, what Friedan called the problem with no name. There was one problem with Friedan's analysis. She mostly interviewed upper-class white women. The voices of women of color or poor women were largely left out, a long-standing problem of the various feminist movements throughout American history. It's also a long-standing problem with the way we remember the 1950s. The 1950s has been characterized as a golden age in American history. One of the most popular shows of the 1970s, when times weren't so good, was called Happy Days, a show set in the 1950s. Movies made about the 1950s portrayed it as a time of peace and innocence, of drive-through movies and teenage romance. The reality is much more complicated than that, though. First of all, the concept of who was white had undergone a major shift since before World War II. The Irish, Italians, Jews, and Poles who came into the country during the late 1800s and early 1900s were not considered properly white by native-born Americans. They spoke different languages, followed different religions, and were generally poorer than the average American when they arrived. Various ethnic categories were created to classify them as neither white nor black. In the 1920s, immigration from these countries was cut off. This set the stage for a radical change. Children of immigrants had attended public school. They grew up speaking American English, wearing American clothing, and watching American movies. By the 1950s, there was no way to tell by appearance that these Americans were, in fact, children of immigrants, or even the grandchildren of immigrants. The physical traits that would make them clearly ethnic had melted away. They had become, for all intents and purposes, white. Being white had its perks. The Wagner Act protected the rights of workers to unionize, but it only covered industrial workers. It just so happened that most industrial workers were white, the children or grandchildren of European immigrants. Farm and domestic workers, a disproportionate amount of whom were black or female, were not covered by the act. This meant the white working class would be better able to afford mortgages for those suburban homes than people of color. The Wagner Act was a boost for white workers while being a barrier for black workers. And even if a black worker had union protection, there was another barrier: the National Housing Act. As we saw, the National Housing Act allowed the government to underwrite home mortgages and made the 30-year mortgage the standard across the country. But it also allowed banks to discriminate against people of color. Banks drew up maps of urban areas. Green neighborhoods contained businesses and rich people. Blue neighborhoods contained middle-class areas. Yellow areas were areas in decline. Red areas were slums, areas with a high proportion of poor whites and people of color. Banks denied mortgages to people in red line areas under the belief that they would be more likely to default, which wasn't true. The effect was that white upper and middle class people were able to move to the suburbs, while people of color were isolated in red-lined inner-city areas. It became the story of vanilla suburbs and chocolate cities. The rise of the highway system made this even worse. In New York City, the man most associated with highways was Robert Moses. Moses was a city planner and power broker who was a master at getting federal funds for the projects he wanted. No project was better funded than the highway system, and he was determined to make New York City an important part of it. Out of all the roads he built, the Cross-Bronx Expressway was possibly his most ambitious and infamous. The South Bronx was a vibrant Jewish and German neighborhood. In the late 1940s, Robert Moses decided to ram an expressway right through the middle of it. But he had to deal with all of those pesky people who lived in its path. He did this through the power of eminent domain. Eminent domain is when the government seizes private property for public use. It was common for Moses to claim that a particular road he wanted to build was vital for public transportation. People who lived in the path of that road had to leave. For good measure, Moses sometimes claimed that the neighborhood he wanted to clear was a slum, a breeding ground for crime and poverty. This would allow him to market his plan as a public good, repurposing the dangerous slums into functioning highways. The South Bronx wasn't a slum, but he wasn't going to let that stand in his way. In the late 1940s, he sent out the first letters to Bronx residents, informing them that they were living in the path of a pre-approved highway and needed to leave. Between 1948 and 1972, the 6-lane highway slowly developed while the buildings in its path were demolished. It was a marvel of engineering, but it was a human tragedy.
So I remember standing on the ground parts of the concourse and watching the engineering job, which was quite magnificent and sublime because you could see the destruction in one direction. Everything was being smashed to the east, and to the west nothing had been done yet. So it looked like a completely intact city, and yet you knew it was like the artillery shells were going to come down on it, in a year, in 2 years, in a month. They didn't tell us.
The completion of the highway wasn't the end of the tragedy. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The expressway itself was a wall of concrete that split the neighborhood in two. It cast a long shadow, literally and figuratively. The residents moved out. Fittingly, they took their cars over the expressway onto I-95, where they moved into Westchester County or suburban areas further upstate. The buildings they left behind, sitting under the expressway's long shadow, became dilapidated. Only the poorest residents would find homes there, typically black migrants from the South or people flying in from Puerto Rico, which was connected to New York City by commercial air travel, and whose residents were citizens and didn't need passports. They came for good-paying jobs, but those jobs were quickly moving into the Sun Belt, locking the new residents into poverty. The South Bronx wasn't a slum before the expressway, but it became one after. In fact, the South Bronx became a red line neighborhood, Without the benefit of low-interest mortgages, another FDR program filled the gap: public housing, what we might call projects today. One of the first urban housing projects was Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, built in 1954. Its rise and fall is a lesson in the changes that overtook the country after World War II. Federal housing projects were designed to be a step up from the tenements that urban workers had been living in before. They were modern facilities with running water, elevators, and electricity. Pruitt-Igoe had 33 11-story buildings located in what urban planners called superblocks. They had parks and walkways as a way to imitate suburban life. Its first residents were largely a mix of working-class whites and blacks. In its first years, it was considered a model of urban renewal, a shining example of how federal programs could materially improve life for the working poor. But the changes ravaging the American economy would fall hard on Pruitt-Igoe. While money went into public housing projects, much more money went into highways and mortgages. They created incentives that drew people out of urban housing projects like Pruitt-Igoe. Since the white working class was much more likely to be unionized thanks to the Wagner Act, they got paid more and were more likely to land a low-interest mortgage from a bank. Black families, especially families headed by black women, were more likely to be non-unionized domestic workers and, therefore, shut out from low-interest mortgages. And even if they got low-interest mortgages, there was another hurdle standing in the way of black people who wanted to move into the suburbs: racist housing covenants. The new suburban developments, like Levittown, often had clear rules that barred home sales to black families. William Levitt himself, not to mention white suburban residents, assumed black residents would bring property values down. A combination of racist policies, the way the Wagner Act protected white workers more than black workers, the way the National Housing Act allowed redlining, and the way racist housing covenants blatantly discriminated against black people, conspired to funnel white people to the suburbs while trapping black people in inner cities. All of this while highways acted like literal walls of segregation. This reverberates down to this very day. Owning a house in the suburbs brings benefits that renting an apartment in the city does not. Houses are property. They increase in value. They can be passed down to children. The children of white suburbanites stood to inherit something. When people talk about racism being systemic, this is what they mean. Racism isn't just people saying hateful words. As a matter of fact, many of the people who benefit from or feed into systemic racism would not consider themselves racist at all. It's policy that actively discriminates against certain groups. It's a legacy of inequality that reproduces itself generation after generation. As the white population of Pruitt-Igoe moved out, conditions there deteriorated. Vandalism and crime increased. The new black residents of Pruitt-Igoe tended to get the blame for this, but the real reasons lay elsewhere. When working-class whites moved out, they no longer paid taxes in the city. The black residents who replaced them tended to get paid less, and therefore paid less in taxes. That meant the services city residents pay for, like sanitation and education, had to be cut. At the same time, factories were moving out of cities like St. Louis in favor of Sunbelt states. As a matter of fact, St. Louis was part of the Rust Belt that lost factory jobs. The jobs that replaced them, the only jobs that new black residents could get, tended to be lower-paying service sector jobs. The sad reality is that black people were moving into urban areas like St. Louis for factory jobs at the exact moment those jobs were leaving. These circumstances were difficult for even the most determined people to overcome. There were maximum income requirements for living in federal housing. If you made above a certain amount, you couldn't live there. This meant that people from the neighborhood who grew up to be lawyers, doctors, or teachers had to move out. This deprived children in Pruitt-Igoe of relatable role models. The superblock layout had a way of physically trapping people inside of the complex. All of your friends and family would be in Pruitt-Igoe. All of the stores you needed were within walking distance. There was very little incentive to visit the world outside. Lack of jobs and opportunities made it more likely for people to turn to crime. For people who spent most hours of the day inside of the complex, there were very few positive or productive pursuits to latch onto. By the 1960s, Pruitt-Igoe was known for crime and filth. It became an example of the rot at the heart of America's cities, starting in the 60s and 70s. While it was easy to blame the residents, the fact was that economic policy had actively neglected inner-city areas in places like St. Louis, Chicago, and New York. Pruitt-Igoe was torn down in 1972. What started as a hopeful experiment of government improving the lives of normal people turned into an emblem of government failure, and an excuse to assassinate the characters of the most vulnerable people in society. It's no coincidence that Pruitt-Igoe was torn down at the exact same time that the Bronx was burning, or that the Crips and Bloods were forming in Los Angeles. Cities everywhere were crumbling by then, an effect of the deindustrialization of the North and government policy that favored the Sun Belt. When Donald Trump says, "Make America Great Again," it's more than likely that his followers remember the 1950s.
I think we were probably our strongest immediately post-World War II.
So around the 1950s?
Yeah, mid-40s, 50s.
I mean, I think the 50s was great other than, segregation and women's rights.
Look, we could sit here and paint negative faces of all times in America.
Correct.
And why not? Most of his followers are white males, the ones who benefited the most. For women, it was the era of the comfortable concentration camp of suburbia. For people of color, it was an era of racist housing covenants in the North and Jim Crow in the South.
Do you think other Negro families will come to Levittown?
Definitely.
Yes.
What do you think will happen?
Well, just what's happening already. I don't know. It's a rumor I read in the paper where they have 2 colored school teachers now in Levittown. So that's just a good example of what is going to happen.
Well, what's wrong with that?
I do not like it. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I'm not thinking I don't want her associating with colored people, period.
Well, I'm very definitely against mixed marriages, and that's eventually what it's going to come to. If children are raised together, they're not going to think of anything of marrying together.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community. And that's the only place I intend to live. If I have to leave Levittown, I will do so.
In foreign policy, it was an era when nuclear war was in the back of everyone's minds. Maybe making America great again, 1950s style, is not so great after all.